Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. What is next for Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks on the recruiting trail? Obviously, coming off the news of five-star linebacker Tyler Atkinson committing to Texas. Look, as much as that stings for Oregon fans, that was always going to be a tough pull. You know, five-star linebacker from the state of Georgia, trying to get him to come to Eugene, Oregon. Look, I would say that the mere fact that Oregon got in that recruitment the way they did kind of tells you the pull that Oregon has on the recruiting trail. Look, there's no way to spin cycle it. It sucks. I think Tyler Atkinson arguably was the best defender that we saw in the 2026 cycle. Now, I'm not going to try to spin it. I think the conversation is, all right, what's next for Oregon? Who are the names that we feel like Oregon needs to close on over the next couple of days and weeks rolling into 2025? It's going to be a small class. I think it's going to be a very similar size class to what we saw in 2025. I believe Oregon signed 19 kids out of high school last cycle. I think that number is going to be relatively similar in 2026. We've talked about it a lot over the last couple of months. It is quality over quantity. If Oregon is going to use their financial resources to bring in a 17, 18-year-old kid out of the high school ranks, they going to feel dang good about it. And they are going to be very selective in terms of what guys they're going to take out of the high school ranks. We've seen that play out. Now, the way I look at it, the offensive side of the football, like if I'm an Oregon fan, I feel pretty good about the 8/9 commitments that we have in the fold. Quarterback Bryson Beaver, although was not necessarily the number one target for Oregon in the 2026 cycle. This is a kid that is screaming up the recruiting rankings. I believe On Three Rivals just put him as a top 50 national prospect, one of the best quarterbacks in the land. It seems high, but look, Bryson Beaver is a guy that you put into the system. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a starting quarterback in 3 to 4 years. I think you really like your running back. He's been lock solid since last summer, right? In Tredarian Bell. Messiah Hampton, Jalen Lott, one of the better wide receiver duos that you see in the country coming into the 2026 cycle, along with Gatlin Bear, who's going to be one of the fastest college football players the minute he steps onto a football field. I would probably remind every Oregon fan that, yeah, we have Gatlin Bear, who's essentially a 2026 commitment. This is the group of guys that he's going to be joining this program with. Five-star tight end Kendra Harrison. You got 3 offensive linemen in the fold, all that give you some versatility. I think Koloi Kelly is probably going to be your center. I'll look at Emmanuel and a guy like Tommy Tofi and say those guys could play tackle and guard. You maybe want one more offensive lineman in the fold just because that's such a difficult position to address in the portal. You want to make sure you stack bodies at the high school ranks, but because the versatility that Emmanuel and Tommy Tofi give you, I think you feel pretty good about what the offensive class looks like. Although it's light on numbers, there's a lot of boxes checked and there's a lot of good players coming into this program. I think the concern for at least myself and a lot of Oregon fans is the defensive side of the football is very light and it's not very complete. I mean, you have 3 safeties that we like a lot, headlined by Jet Washington, who I absolutely love. But outside of that, there are some serious gaps, specifically in the front 7, which is such an important position to recruit at the high school ranks. Look, why is a team like Georgia trotting out some of the best defenses every single year? It's because they get the Jimmies and Joes at the high school ranks. On the offensive side of the football, look, you can win with scheme to an extent. You still need good football players. If you have a good play caller and you have a good quarterback, you're going to be able to score points on the offensive side of the football. On the defensive side, go look at the recruiting rankings and then go look at the best defenses in the country. There is a direct correlation. The teams that recruit the best at the high school ranks, the guys that just have big, fast defense players, they're the teams that trot out the best defenses in the country. That's my biggest concern for Oregon as it pertains to the 2026 cycle. What does Oregon need to do over the next couple of days and weeks to fix that? That's the conversation we're going to get into. Before we do, and as always, to the Oregon fans, this program since Dan Lanning has taken over has been so fun to talk about, especially when it comes to the recruiting trail. I know it's been a little bit more of a rocky road in 2026, but the support you guys continue to show to the fellas is amazing. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. how about a vibe check? How about a vibe check in the comments section from the Oregon fans that follow this program closely on the recruiting trail? Would love to hear how you guys are feeling in the comment section. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with Nick Abrams committing tomorrow. Now, this one is a tricky situation because I think a lot of people assume, look, if Tyler Atkinson goes to Georgia, which was the general assumption until Texas came in late and got this one done, you kind of figured Nick Abrams may be in a better spot for the Oregon Ducks. Well, the fact that Tyler Atkinson chose Texas, I think, makes the battle for Nick Abrams between Georgia and Oregon real down the stretch. And it sounds like Georgia might be the leader in the clubhouse. If Oregon doesn't land Nick Abrams, what happens next? That's a very fair question for Oregon fans because I feel like you want to take more than just one linebacker in Tristan Phillips. Because I go back to the 2025 cycle and say Gavin Nix, excuse me, from IMG Academy was really your only off-ball linebacker you took. And so you probably want to take at least two in the 2026 cycle. Now go back to 2024. You brought in, I believe, 3 or 4 blue chip linebackers. So you feel decent about the young talent in the room, but you probably want to land 2 linebackers in 2026. If Nick Abrams ends up going to Georgia, it will be an interesting conversation to see what other linebacker appears for Oregon on their board. And I mean, I feel like we should add this into the conversation at least a little, and that is Dan Lanning in Oregon. They historically do their best work in November and December, and especially with how unique this football team is in 2020 or going into the 2025 year, where they have the opportunity to not only be a really good football team, but be a really good football team with a lot of young talent. And when you start, competing for Big Ten championships, competing in the college football playoffs with 19, 20-year-old kids. And these kids at the high score ranks are looking at Oregon winning a lot of football games and they doing it with guys that are a year or two older than them. That helps you on the recruiting trail. And so, look, there's going to be names that I think bubble up for Oregon later on in this process. Number 2, Duce Gerald. I think he's probably the biggest target for Oregon in this cycle. You look at how difficult it is to get difference makers on the defensive line. And look, I know Oregon just did it with Derek Carmen 12 months ago. That's very difficult. And I don't think that's something that Dan Lanning wants to rely upon every single offseason in the portal. Duce Gerald is that guy. It's not a shot at Tony Cumberland, who I think is going to be a damn solid football player for Oregon, but I'm not really sure what that ceiling looks like. Duce Gerald, you're looking at a guy that could eventually and potentially replace the production and presence that Derek Carmen gave Oregon. That's the kind of football player Duce Gerald is. He's not going to be as big as Derek Carmen. This dude is a super hyper athlete on the inside of the defensive line. Really powerful cat, really twitchy cat. This is a guy that you could see going for 8+ sacks and 12 TFLs, being that game-wrecking presence on the inside of the defensive line. He seems, in my opinion, he might not be the highest ranked, but I look at him and say he feels like he's the biggest target for Oregon in the 2026 cycle. And that's going to come down to Oregon and Michigan. It sounds like Oregon's in the lead. Edge position, Anthony Jones. Very similar to Tyler Atkinson. Look, I think Oregon has a real chance at Anthony Tank Jones. There ain't no doubt about it. But when you look at it on paper, it's a 5-star edge defender from the state of Alabama, a guy that Alabama is pushing very hard for, along with Texas A&M, and say, I'm not ruling it out for Oregon, but that probably is an uphill battle. And so you got to figure out, what do we want to do at the edge position, because you certainly want to bring in more than just one edge rusher. And then the back end, Devon Benjamin, I love him. I mean, I think he could be a great safety, a great cornerback. He's one of the best pure football players in the country. Although he's the highest graded prospect of the guys we're talking about, I don't know if he's the biggest priority, because I look at that cornerback room and say, geez, I mean, Naheem Offer, Brandon Finney, Dorian Brew, go back another class, Dakota Fields, Ifio. I mean, it is they don't need to take a single cornerback in this class, and they're going to be fine at the cornerback position because of the young talent they've stacked. I guess I look at it and say, you just gotta. I respect and I understand the quality over quantity approach, but there has to be a certain amount of guys that you're bringing, especially in the front seven. That is a position where you got to get it right at the high school ranks, because you ain't going to find guys like a Mateo you in the portal. If you want those high-end future top 10 NFL draft picks, you're very, very rarely going to find them in the portal, which means you have to get them right at the high school ranks. That's Duce Gerald's. That's Anthony Tank Jones. We'll see how it works out for Oregon. Again, I think this conversation will be more pertinent come November and December, especially if Oregon's as good of a football team as I think they're going to be. But you feel like the potential difference makers, especially on the defensive side of the football, Oregon's got to go out and get a few of these guys. We'll close it down there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Hey, we will break down the commitments as they come in, I believe. So we got Nick Abrams coming tomorrow. We got Duce Gerald and Devon Benjamin on August 2nd. That could be a massive day for the Oregon Ducks. We'll continue to track it. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.